Growing up in the rural Midwest, you learn quickly that silence isn't just the absence of noise. It is a heavy physical presence that settles over the fields like a thick fog. My hometown, which I'll call Thorn Creek, was a skeletal remains of a place. One blinking yellow light, a hardware store, a diner that smelled of old grease, and a population that barely cracked the triple digits. It was the kind of town where everyone knew your business before you even did. By the time I hit my senior year, my closest friend, Elias, had moved 2 hours away to the city following his parents' messy split. Despite the distance, he'd trek back in his beat-up Ford every single weekend to see his girlfriend, and, if the stars aligned, grab a few illicit beers with me. We were 17, restless, and convinced that the cornfields surrounding us were hiding secrets far more interesting than our actual lives. It was a humid Saturday in late May, just weeks before graduation. Elias was back in town, but his girl was away on a family trip, leaving us with nothing but a full tank of gas and a crushing sense of boredom. We spent an hour aimlessly driving the gravel backroads, hurling empty bottles at rusted stop signs, watching the glass shatter against the metal in the moonlight. The night felt stagnant, like a held breath waiting to be released. Lately, I had been working late shifts at the local depot, stocking shelves while lost in the dark world of paranormal podcasts. One specific story about a hollowed-out house in the Nebraska plains had crawled under my skin and stayed there. The way the narrator described the isolation of the prairie felt uncomfortably familiar. I suggested to Elias that we go find something truly abandoned to explore, a real-life set for a horror story. We had lived in Thorn Creek our entire lives, but we rarely ventured onto the private properties that lined the hidden dirt veins of the county. We'd fished the creeks and played manhunt in the stalks, but we never dared to cross the no trespassing lines. That night, however, the thrill of the unknown outweighed our common sense. We turned onto an overgrown path that felt like it hadn't seen a tire tread in over a decade. The path terminated at a massive 2-story barn that loomed against the stars like a jagged tooth. There were no electric lights, no signs of life, just the silver glow of the moon reflecting off the weathered wood. I told Elias to kill the headlights before we got too close. The last thing we needed was a local farmer mistaking us for thieves and reaching for his 12-gauge. We rolled to a stop in total, suffocating darkness. Inside, I was vibrating with a mix of adrenaline and genuine dread. We had no idea if the place was truly empty or if someone was watching us from the hayloft. Elias spun the truck around so we were facing the exit, a tactical move in case we needed to peel out in a hurry. The silence was so absolute that the sound of our boots hitting the dry earth felt like gunshots, echoing across the empty, desolate acreage. As we approached, the moon illuminated the skeletal remains of a cattle ranch, a collapsed windmill, overturned rusted troughs, and a silo that looked ready to topple. It was a graveyard of industry. We tried several side doors, each one reinforced and locked tight from the inside. Finally, we reached the massive double doors at the front. To our collective shock, they yielded with a heavy, low groan, swinging wide open. The interior wasn't dark. A flickering amber glow pulsed from the center of the structure. We realized with a jolt that dozens of candles were burning throughout the space. Elias gripped his flashlight but refused to click it on, terrified of drawing attention. The air inside was thick, smelling of old hay, metallic copper, and melting wax. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to turn around and run back to the truck. The barn had been transformed. Candelabras were perched on makeshift altars made of shipping crates, and the layout looked disturbingly like a cathedral. Someone had been here recently, minutes ago, perhaps to light the wicks. In the very center of the floor stood a stone slab. We moved toward it, drawn by a morbid magnetic curiosity. Sticking upright out of the center of the slab was a jagged, black-handled hunting knife. The blade had been driven through the throat of a young goat, its white fur stained a deep, horrific crimson. The blood was still wet, glistening in the candlelight. "Elias, we need to go. Now," I whispered, my voice cracking. We didn't wait for a response. We sprinted for the truck, the sound of our own gasping breath filling our ears. As the engine roared to life, I glanced back at the barn one last time. In the flickering shadows of the doorway, I saw them, 3 or 4 tall, hooded figures standing perfectly still, watching us. A heavy thud vibrated through the frame of the truck as something, a rock or a blunt object, slammed into the tailgate. Elias floored it, the tires screaming as they tore through the dirt. We didn't stop until we hit the main highway, our hearts hammering against our ribs like trapped birds. The drive back to Thorn Creek was a blur of white knuckles and frantic glances at the rearview mirror. We didn't speak for the first 20 miles. The silence of the truck cabin only broken by the frantic hum of the engine and our own ragged breathing. Every pair of headlights that appeared behind us felt like a death sentence, a spectral pursuit from the hooded figures at the barn. We were terrified that whatever we had interrupted had followed us back into the world of the living. It took us nearly 40 minutes to reach the familiar safety of the town limits. By then, the adrenaline was beginning to ebb, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. We pulled into a gas station parking lot under the buzzing neon lights, finally feeling safe enough to inspect the damage. There was a deep, jagged dent in the metal of the tailgate. It wasn't just a rock. It felt like a warning, a physical mark left by the entities we had fled from in the dark. We made a silent pact right there in the flickering light of the 7-Eleven. We would never tell a soul about what we saw at Blackwood Farm. In a town as small as ours, trespassing on a cult compound wasn't just a legal issue. It was a social suicide mission. We feared that the people in those hoods might be the same people we saw at the grocery store or the post office every Monday morning. The paranoia began to take root in our young minds. I stayed in Thorn Creek for 1 more year after graduation, but the landscape had changed for me. Every empty barn and every stretch of cornfield now felt like a veil hiding something monstrous. I eventually packed my life into a U-Haul and moved to the city of Oak Haven to start a career in heavy masonry. My parents followed shortly after, retiring to the coast. There was no reason for me to ever return to that haunted patch of dirt, yet the memory of the altar remained. Even now, years later, I find myself scouring satellite maps of the county, trying to locate that specific dirt road. But the prairie has a way of swallowing its secrets. Buildings decay, roads overgrow, and in the harsh light of day, everything looks different than it does under a blood-red moon. I've heard the rumors of secluded groups operating in the deep Midwest, but I don't need rumors to know the truth. I saw the knife. I saw the figures. I felt the malice. My transition to city life didn't bring the peace I expected. In my early 20s, I took a job as a residential utility inspector for the city of Oak Haven. My task was simple: enter properties, navigate to the meters, and record the data for the monthly billing cycles. It was a job that required me to be a ghost, a transient observer in the most private lives of strangers. Often I had to enter homes when the owners were away at work, using keys provided to the agency. I never truly adjusted to the invasive nature of the work. No matter how many times I knocked or announced my presence, entering a silent, empty house felt like a violation. A home's exterior is a mask, a curated image of normalcy that people project to their neighbors. But once you step through that threshold, the mask begins to slip. You see the piles of unopened mail, the unwashed dishes, the subtle signs of neglect or obsession that define a human life. If you want the raw, unfiltered truth of a person, you have to go where the light doesn't reach. For a utility inspector, that meant the basement. I developed a visceral hatred for those subterranean spaces. I've seen things that would make most people quit on the first day. I've walked into basements where the walls seemed to vibrate, only to realize I was looking at thousands of cockroaches scurrying over the peeling white paint in the dark. I've navigated through cobwebs, so thick they felt like wet silk against my face, looking like a cotton candy machine had malfunctioned in a tomb. I've stumbled over illegal weapon caches, makeshift laboratories, and hordes of trash that reach the ceiling. I've even seen a high-end coffin sitting in the middle of a laundry room. Most of these things have rational, if depressing, explanations. But there was one basement in Oak Haven that defied every law of logic. It was an aging 3-story apartment complex on the edge of the industrial district. From the sidewalk, it looked like a standard Victorian-era relic, gray and unassuming. I entered through the service door at the rear, which led directly to a steep, narrow wooden staircase plunging into the darkness. I reached for the light switch on the landing, clicking it back and forth, but the bulb was dead. I was standing at the edge of a black abyss. I stood at the top of that staircase, staring into a darkness so thick it felt like a physical weight against my chest. As a rule, I preferred to travel light during my 5-hour walking routes, so I rarely carried a heavy-duty flashlight. Instead, I relied on the weak, pathetic glow of my handheld data terminal. It barely illuminated a foot of space in front of me, making the world look like a series of disjointed, grainy snapshots as I began my slow descent into the basement. The wooden steps groaned under my weight, each creak sounding like a warning in the absolute silence of the building. Once I reached the cold concrete floor, I had to shuffle blindly, keeping my head down and my arms outstretched to avoid walking into a support beam or a low-hanging pipe. The air down there was stale and carried a sharp, metallic tang that made my skin crawl. I felt like an intruder in a space that had long since forgotten the presence of light. Guided by the dim screen of my terminal, I eventually reached the far wall and located 2 heavy, identical wooden doors. I knew the meters were supposed to be tucked away in one of these side rooms. I chose the door on the right, which opened with a reluctant scrape against the floor. Inside, I found the utility bank nestled in the corner and began tapping the usage data into my device, relieved to be nearly finished with this particular stop. That was when the first sound broke the silence. It didn't come from the room I was in, but from the other side of the thin wall to my left. It was a faint, rhythmic scratching, followed by a low, desperate whimpering. My heart skipped a beat as I realized there was a living creature trapped in the adjacent room. It sounded like a dog one that was profoundly weak, distressed, and perhaps reaching the end of its endurance. I stepped back into the main basement area and tried the handle of the second door, but it was locked tight with a heavy deadbolt. The whimpering intensified as the animal heard me on the other side. I could hear its claws fumbling uselessly against the wood. A wave of helplessness washed over me. I wasn't authorized to break down doors, and I had no way of knowing who owned this unit or why they would leave a pet in total, suffocating darkness. I finished my data entry with trembling hands and practically ran out of that building. As soon as I returned to the main office, I filed an official report about the suspected animal neglect. But in the world of city bureaucracy, paper trails move slowly. For the next 4 weeks, the sound of that scratching followed me into my dreams. I couldn't stop imagining that dog waiting in the dark, wondering if anyone was ever coming back for it. A month later, my route inevitably brought me back to the same Victorian apartment complex. The sense of dread I felt standing at that back door was nearly overwhelming. I had brought a proper light this time, but the battery flickered and died the moment I stepped onto the landing. It felt like the house itself was rejecting the intrusion of light, forcing me back into the same blind shuffle toward the meter rooms. I moved toward the room on the right, my ears straining for any sign of life from the locked door next to it. This time there was nothing but silence. No scratching, no whimpering, no signs of movement at all. Part of me hoped the dog had been rescued, but a darker part of my mind feared the worst. Curiosity, fueled by a month of guilt and unanswered questions, finally got the best of me as I stood before the locked door. I reached out and gently jiggled the doorknob, just to see if it had been left unlatched. I hadn't even applied pressure when the silence was shattered by a sound that nearly paralyzed my heart. It was a blood-curdling scream that tore through the basement, a sound so raw and violent that I couldn't believe it was coming from a human throat. It started as a piercing, high-pitched shriek before collapsing into a series of guttural, rhythmic moans. The noise was chaotic, shifting between agonized wails and a terrifying, loud form of sobbing that echoed off the concrete walls. It sounded like some kind of psychotic, free-form jazz of human misery. I stumbled backward, my handheld terminal slipping from my numb fingers as I shouted into the dark, asking if anyone was okay or if they needed help. But there was no verbal response, only the continuation of those soul-shattering screams. I stood frozen as the screaming continued, a sound so demented it felt like it was physically clawing at my skin. There was no doubt that whoever was behind that door could hear my frantic shouting, yet they offered no words, only an escalating volume of pure, unadulterated agony. Realizing I was in a situation far beyond my control, I fumbled through the darkness, desperate to find the exit and escape the auditory nightmare. Even after I reached the top of the stairs and burst through the back door, the echoes of those shrieks seemed to follow me into the sunlight. I reported the incident immediately, but just like the month before, the authorities found no reason to intervene in what they deemed a private residence matter. As the weeks passed, a profound sense of dread began to fester within me, knowing that my job would eventually force me back into that basement. I spent my nights constructing elaborate, terrifying explanations for what lived beyond that locked door. Was it a victim of some horrific crime, or a monster that preferred the crushing silence of a lightless room? By the time my next rotation arrived, I had built the mystery up to such a height that I expected to find something supernatural. However, for several months after that, the basement remained unnervingly quiet and empty. The breakthrough finally came unexpectedly during a night out with my friend Lara. After a local concert, I offered to drive her to her new apartment, a place she had moved into just weeks prior. As we pulled up to the curb, my blood ran cold. She was pointing directly at the Victorian house with the screaming basement. I began to ask her if she had noticed anything strange, but she cut me off before I could finish. Lara confirmed my worst fears. A crazy guy lived in the basement and frequently kept the other tenants awake with his late-night yelling. She described a chilling encounter she had while walking to her car. The man had been standing perfectly still on the lawn, acting like a living statue directly in her path. He offered no reaction to her greeting, except for one bizarre and deeply unsettling gesture. As Lara passed him, the man suddenly stuck his tongue out at her, then quickly sucked it back into his mouth before returning to his frozen, statue-like state. This confirmation that the screamer was a real physical presence made the prospect of my next inspection even more terrifying. 2 months later, the moment finally arrived when I would come face to face with the source of the basement's dark energy. I entered the back door and immediately noticed a change. A dim light was actually on in the basement. At the bottom of the stairs, the same ragged, sickly dog I had heard months ago was staring up at me with hollow eyes. Then my gaze shifted to the space behind the animal. I could see a pair of bare, pale feet standing on the cold concrete, the rest of the body obscured by the low ceiling. Every survival instinct told me to run, but my obsession with the mystery was too strong to ignore. I called out my title as a meter reader and began my final descent into the room. As I moved down the steps, the man was slowly revealed. He was middle-aged, with a shaved head and wild, unfocused eyes. He wore no shirt, revealing a body that was disturbingly lean and sinewy. He looked like a person whose muscles were constantly tensed, as if he were never truly at rest. To my utter surprise, when I explained my presence, he responded in a way that sounded almost normal. The pitch of his voice was off, but the words were the standard pleasantries people give to utility workers. For a brief, fleeting second, I actually wondered if I had imagined the screaming. As I moved toward the meters, the man's veneer of normalcy began to fracture. He started pacing the small room with a frantic, animalistic energy, his bare feet slapping against the cold floor. His hands were locked together, wringing and twisting as if he were trying to scrub his own skin off. Every few seconds, his head would snap violently from one side to the other, a series of sporadic, involuntary jerks that made it impossible for him to maintain eye contact. The longer I stayed in that confined space, the more agitated he became. His face began to contort into deep, painful-looking grimaces, and strange verbal tics started to interrupt his speech. He would be in the middle of a sentence about the weather or the utility bill, and suddenly he would blurt out a sharp, loud awe. It was clear he was fighting a losing battle against the mounting pressure inside his own mind. The air in the basement felt charged with a volatile energy, and I realized I was trapped in a room with a man on the verge of a total psychological collapse. I finished my readings as quickly as possible and began to back toward the staircase, keeping my eyes on him the entire time. His outbursts grew louder and more frequent with every step I took toward the exit, the awe sounds turning into short, aggressive barks. I reached the bottom of the stairs and muttered a quick goodbye, desperate to get back to the safety of the world above. The moment I turned my back to begin the ascent, the dam finally broke. He let out a shriek so loud it felt like it vibrated the very foundation of the building, the exact same unforgettable scream I had heard through the locked door months earlier. It was a sound of pure, unbridled madness. I didn't look back. I took the stairs two at a time, my heart slamming against my ribs, and flung myself through the back door into the blinding light of the afternoon. I stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, gasping for air and trying to shake the feeling of those wild eyes boring into my back. I never entered that basement again. I made sure my supervisor assigned that specific route to someone else for the next cycle. A few months later, I was catching up with Laura at my place when the subject of the basement man came up again. I was ready to tell her about the pacing and the screaming, but the look on her face told me she had a much darker update. She told me that a few weeks prior, she had seen multiple police cruisers and an ambulance swarming the Victorian house, their flashing lights illuminating the entire block. The officers had hauled the man out in handcuffs and placed him in the back of a squad car while he stared blankly at the sky. Laura learned from another tenant that the man's internal pressure had finally bubbled over into physical violence. He had allegedly attacked a delivery driver with a kitchen knife in the hallway. He was gone, and the dark room in the basement was finally silent, though the stain of his presence remained. I don't know where they took him, whether it was a prison or a psychiatric ward, but I find myself hoping he found some kind of peace. The alternative, that he is still out there, locked in a different dark room with his own screaming thoughts, is a reality I'm not quite ready to face. In the end, I learned that there is always a reason to be afraid of what hides beneath the surface of a normal life.